Okay, welcome back, everyone. I think Adam is here with us, so hello. Okay, I'm going to introduce Adam. Okay, Adam is a 14 times certified Salesforce architect at Google. He's also a Salesforce MVP. Also a Pluralsight author and Red Women coach. For those of you who Red Women, it's a non-profit program that offers courses for Salesforce beginners. He also he likes helping others and especially with the coding part of the Salesforce platform. Also, Adam, I think he broke the record for the contributions in the Salesforce community groups. And I really want to thank him because he was really flexible with the timing, and he responded to me in a very short time when I asked him to speak in this meeting. So hello, Adam. I want to introduce you to Kishk. Kishk is a Salesforce architect at Entity Data. He actually started the Cairo community back in 2017. And he speaks in every meeting. He tells us something new every time. So I learned a lot from him, and I'm sure he helped everyone here in this group. So you can start.
Awesome. Thanks, Farron. Good to meet you too, Kish.
It's a pleasure to meet you as well, Adam.
All right. Well, I appreciate the introduction. I can go ahead and share my screen here. All right. Cool. Am I good to get started then, Farah?
Yes.
Cool. All right. So today my presentation is Lightning Components 101, an Apex Developer's Guide. Before I get started, I just wanted to say, and I apologize if I mispronounced this, Assalamu alaikum and shukran. Thank you so much for having me. I've never had the pleasure of visiting Egypt, but I would definitely love to make the trip out sometime once things calm down a little bit around the world virus-wise. Yeah, like Farah mentioned, my name's Adam. I work as a Salesforce engineer for Google with the devices team. 14 certifications, over 600 Trailhead badges, and I am really passionate about helping people code on the Salesforce platform. So feel free to connect with me afterward on Twitter, Adam17AMO, on LinkedIn. Shoot me an email, adam@adamtoarchitect.com. And if you're not yet on the Lightning experience, as Farah mentioned as well, I have a Pluralsight course that might be able to help with the migration, and you can find that at bit.ly/lightning migration. All right. So let's get into a little bit kind of why I wanted to give the talk. So again, it's Lightning Components 101, an Apex Developer's Guide. So like me, you may have some familiarity with Apex, maybe not as much JavaScript. And so this is kind of a version of my career path, if you will, right? I went along my career happily developing in Apex, happily developing on the back end. And I started hearing these terms from various places, you know, front end, JavaScript, client side. I kind of brushed them off to the side. You know, I heard them, I was vaguely aware of them, didn't necessarily know fully what they meant. I figured it would be okay. So as I went on my back-end career, I started seeing statistics like this. And this is a survey from Stack Overflow from 2019 of 72,000 professional developers. And they said that JavaScript is actually the most commonly used language for the 7th year in a row. 70% of developers mentioned using JavaScript. Number 2 was HTML and CSS, which of course goes very closely with JavaScript and kind of the languages of the front end web development. So JavaScript is pretty popular. That's pretty apparent. In case the Stack Overflow survey wasn't enough, I also saw this report from GitHub that tracks GitHub pull requests. And so since 2013, again, about 7 years, JavaScript has been #1 in GitHub pull requests. So more people are developing with JavaScript on GitHub than any other language. If you were curious, Apex is in 39th place. And I think Python is rapidly catching up to JavaScript, but JavaScript's been on top for a while now. And again, this is from 2019, I believe. So 20%, in fact, of all the pull requests from GitHub are in JavaScript. But apparently JavaScript's pretty popular and has been for a while, and I've kind of been pushing it off to the side. And one day I took a look around, and there was a lot I didn't know, and a lot of very popular, common development and programming knowledge that I didn't know. And while the backend is safe, I kind of felt like I was at the top of a cliff without a harness, and I really needed to do something about it. And so that's kind of why I wanted to start getting into front-end development, and I figured others would benefit from that as well. So my kind of expectations, you have some familiarity with Apex. I don't want anyone thinking they can learn JavaScript in under an hour. I don't know if 40 hours would be enough necessarily, but I do want you to start understanding common patterns between front-end and back-end code, and hopefully gaining some confidence to start building some components on your own after the talk is done. All right, so in terms of the agenda for today, we're going to start off with an Apex overview, get into kind of what are components. Going to do a comparison of Visualforce versus Lightning Web Components, deep dive into Lightning Web Components, a couple demos mixed in there. And I'm kind of framing this as step 1 on your journey to front end. We're going to wrap things up, summarize things, and then talk about step 2 and maybe even step 3 after the talk today, where to go from there. All right, so starting off with an Apex overview, just a quick review, things that we probably have a fair familiar grasp of if we've worked with Apex before. For the most part, Apex comes in 2 flavors. You have your triggers and you have your classes and controllers, right? Your triggers are where you capture events, right? Before insert, after update, things like that. Events cause your triggers to fire. Your classes and controllers are where you put your methods, your parameters, your return values, and then mixed in there in both are your variables, right? So this is kind of the bread and butter of Apex, the 2 flavors there. We also might be familiar with asynchronous Apex, annotating our methods with things like @future, or we have specifically defined parts of code we need to put into interfaces like batchable, right? We have to have an execute method, we have to have a start method, right? There are parts of the code that we're required to have by implementing an interface. All right, we probably worked with Visualforce at least at some point. Visualforce follows the model view controller model of coding, generally uses HTML type tags, right? Apex page block, Apex data table. And then we can also have bind variables and bind methods to tie back to our Apex. So we can have the curly bracket, bang, exclamation point, and reference things in our Apex controller from our Visualforce page. All right. We also probably know that there are some, say, limitations in working with Apex and Visualforce, right? You might run into governor limits. It's very button click based. Every time you want to do anything else, you have to click some buttons. And ultimately, we oftentimes see there's poor performance along with that. Every time, click a button, have to make a call to the Salesforce backend, and then return it back to the front end. And sometimes we just kind of hack solutions together, right? We might Google a JavaScript script somewhere on the web, find it, copy, paste, throw it into our Visualforce page. Everything works, so we don't know what it does, but we don't question it because everything's working. Kind of like this car here, right? Doesn't look great, but it works, so we don't question it too much. But really, there has to be a better way, and as developers, we know probably not the best way to go about things, just throwing random stuff together. All right, so let's get into this kind of new way of programming, a new programming model, sometimes called MVCC. I like to call it MVC++. But we'll see why in a second here. So a quick look at the Salesforce kind of development journey. Back in Dreamforce 2007, Salesforce was founded late 1990s. And at some point, they realized people want to interact with UIs. And in the mid-2000s, things were very button-click based. And so Salesforce came out with Visualforce, a way to build your own custom UIs, click buttons, and see different things on the screen. And that was fine for a while, but we've seen since around 2013 or so, JavaScript's become a lot more popular. Customers and users have been wanting more responsive design, right? I drag a slider on the page automatically updates. I enter a value in a field, the page automatically updates. I don't want to have to be doing all this button clicking anymore. And so in 2015, Salesforce came out with the Lightning Aura component framework, right? Using an open source programming JavaScript framework called Aura, now allowed you to build custom JavaScript UI components. And that was fine for a few years. But as we're going to see in a little bit, the industry around web development has been changing rapidly as it's gained in popularity. And so Salesforce adapted again by giving us the Lightning Web Component model. That was launched early last year, around January 2019. And so at this point, if you haven't already started into Aura components, you're probably better off just skipping it, because all Aura components are behind the scenes are Lightning Web components that are wrapped up in some packaging. So really, they're just slower Lightning Web components. So if you haven't gotten into components yet, skip straight to LWC at this point. All right, so we'll talk more about that journey a little bit later. But let's go back here to where we were with Visualforce. Right, this is kind of a high-level overview of the MVC framework. Right, we started with a user on their laptop, for example. Right, we're going to call this the client. This is the thing that's making the request, the laptop. And it's going to make a call to Salesforce, the server, right? In our case, it's Salesforce. And on the server, on Salesforce, everything lives, right? We have our Visualforce, we have our code, our application logic, and we have our model, our database, our objects, and our fields. All that's on Salesforce. So when I'm sitting on my laptop working with Visualforce, I have to make a request to Salesforce. It has to do its computation and then send it all the way back to me. So I'm waiting for a complete round trip every button click I make. And that was fine for a while, but as I mentioned, there can be some performance implications along with that, and users want things a lot snappier, a lot more responsive design. And so we're going to move some of this a little bit here. We're going to keep the controller, the apex, and our objects and fields, our model on the server. That's not going anywhere. What we're going to do, though, is we're going to move the view, our UI, completely to the client side, completely to the user's browser. So the UI is going to live in the browser now. And because it's kind of pointless to have the UI in the browser if we have to make a Salesforce call every time we want to do any logic, we're going to add a second JavaScript controller into the browser as well. So now the browser has the view and one of the controllers, and Salesforce has another controller plus the model. So that's why people like to call this MVCC, right? So we're dealing with two controllers, one on the front end, one on the back end now. And in some cases, we don't even need to call Salesforce. We can have everything happen right away in the browser, and we save that performance improvement having to call in response. Right, so let's talk about Lightning components. What is a Lightning component? No, it really is a package for multiple files. So if we think about Visualforce, right, we have a Visualforce page on its own. We have to tell it what Apex controller to use. That's sitting over here. We have to tell them to talk to each other. With components, though, we can kind of bundle everything up. And so the UI automatically knows what controller to use. The controller automatically knows what helper file to use. The UI automatically knows what CSS file to use, because they're all contained together in this Lightning component bundle. So when we talk about a Lightning component, it's just a bunch of files to know about each other. And like Apex, they also kind of come in two flavors, right? We have our Aura components, which we mentioned came out in 2015. And then we have our Lightning Web components, which came out last year, 2019. We're going to be focusing on the Lightning Web Components side of things today. And along with Lightning Web Components, both of these come with their own UI. Both of them come with their own front-end controller. Both of them come with built-in CSS. The Lightning Web Component also has an XML file we're going to work with. These are really the main 4 files you're going to see used in a Lightning Web Component. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. All right, so before we talk about what's new with components, let's talk about what's not new. Let's kind of, do you already know how to work with components? So we're going to go through a couple different examples of things that haven't really changed, and then walk through a demo to prove it. So the first thing that hasn't really changed with components are how the UI works. Right? We're used to tags in our UI from Visualforce, right? Apex page block. That's not changing at all. So in our old framework in Visualforce, all the tags started with Apex. The tag names themselves are going to change, but the idea of using tags is. So we're dealing with the Lightning Web Component framework now. So a lot of our tags are going to start with Lightning instead of, Apex input. We're going to have Lightning input. We're also going to embrace more standards. We're going to start using standard HTML tags. So they're not going to have any even Salesforce branding on them. And so I don't have to Google Salesforce tag anymore. I can just Google the name of the tag, and anyone that does web development is going to have the same resources. So we're going to see standard HTML tags. We're going to see tags starting with Lightning. And we're also going to see some custom tags. I can bring another component into my component. And those tags are generally going to start with the letter C, C being the default namespace of our org. If our org is an ISV, we might have a different namespace in the org. So primarily 3 different types of tags we're going to see, but we're already used to using tags in our UI anyway. Right, the concept of event-based code, we're familiar with triggers, where code fires in response to events. And with Apex, everything's happening on the server. Everything's happening in Salesforce. So we're always waiting for database events, right? Before insert, after update, when a database event happens, we want code to fire. But now we've moved our view in one of our controllers to the front end. So we want to wait for the browser events. We don't want to have to deal with Salesforce a lot of the time. So we're going to be waiting for browser events now. So the event names are going to change. For example, we might be looking for an onChange event when some text entered into a text box changes. When that value changes, we want to fire off some code. Or maybe a user does click a button. When they click that button, the onClick event, we're going to fire off some code. Again, same sort of concept. Some event happens, and we fire off some code. The only difference now, we're looking for browser events instead of backend Salesforce database events. Right, bind variables, again, we've seen this before in Visualforce. The syntax is changing slightly. We're taking away the exclamation point, the same sort of thing. We're going to reference controller variables in our front-end UI. And the same with methods. Again, the exclamation point is going to go away, but we're still going to be able to reference controller methods in our front-end UI. And because we have 2 controllers now, we can reference them in 2 different ways. If we're referencing our JavaScript controller from our front-end UI, we're going to use the same syntax we're used to from Visualforce with the curly bracket. If we're referencing our Apex controller from our JavaScript controller, we're actually going to be able to give it a custom name. And we're going to see an example of that in a little while. But we can name it whatever we want and then use it accordingly. All right, and the last thing that we're also kind of used to, again, a component is a bundle of multiple files, but we're already kind of used to dealing with multiple files if you think about it. Right, we have a Visualforce page, we have an Apex controller, maybe we have another Apex utility class or Apex helper. So we have multiple files in our application already. And same thing is going to be the case here. The only difference now, the types of files are going to change a little bit, but we're still going to have a UI file in the form of an HTML file. We're still going to have a primary controller. The only difference is it's moving to the front end now, so the JavaScript controller. And then we're still going to have that backend Apex controller if we need it. So we're just dealing with multiple files, but they know a little bit more about each other without us having to tell them. All right, so let's do a little comparison here between Visualforce and Lightning Web Components, and then walk through some of the code. All right, let me make this a little bit bigger here. All right, so I have 2 components here. One says hello Visualforce, and one says hello LWC. And if I look at my hello Visualforce here, I'm going to say hello to Cairo. And so I had to type this in. I had to click update. Takes half a second, and then we see hello Cairo showing up in our text here. It works, okay. But let me go down here to our Lightning Web Component. I don't have to type. I don't have to click a button. I don't have to wait. I can just type. And again, I see hello Cairo showing up here. Much more responsive, much faster, and no extra button clicks, which is always a good thing anytime we can save a user extra clicks. All right, so how do we make all of that happen? Let's take a look at our Visualforce page first. The Visualforce page isn't really complicated here. Again, we start with an Apex page tag. We have to tell it what controller to use. We want to use a Hello World controller. And really, there's just 3 parts to it. There's the button that says update. And then there's the output text and the input text. So we're outputting hello greeting. and we're inputting this greeting variable, right, with our bind syntax. And then we're using that bind syntax again in our output. The other thing we see when we click the button, we have to tell Visualforce, hey, I want to re-render the output value. So whenever I click the button, go get whatever greeting is and re-render the greeting so that it shows up on my Visualforce page. Right, so we tell it to re-render, we tell it what controller to use, and then we're just using bind syntax for an output and an input. And the controller itself, pretty basic, just a getter and setter for a greeting variable. Let's go take a look at our Lightning Web Component, though. It's actually less code here. And if we look, it's really doing the same thing. Again, we have some sort of output component. In this case, we're using a standard HTML component, the P, the paragraph tag. And again, it says hello, greeting, again, with our bind variable syntax, just like Visualforce. Remember, instead of Apex input, now we have Lightning input. So we have an input tag again. But otherwise, everything's the same. Our output says hello, greeting, referencing the greeting bind variable. Again, our input value is set to the greeting bind variable. And here we have one of those browser events, right? We're capturing the onChange event. So anytime the value I'm typing in changes in that text box, we want to call the handle change method in our controller. And again, using that bind method syntax here. So again, output and input, and then we call our handle change method when the value changes. So let's go take a look at the Lightning Web Component controller here. This is our JavaScript controller for our Hello World component. And we see a couple of things in here. It's relatively basic. The first thing I want to point out are these import and export statements. So if you're working with Java at all, you're probably used to importing various libraries to bring in additional functionality. We're going to see that a lot with Lightning Web Components. So pretty much any Lightning Web Component you're going to write is always going to import from the LWC namespace. And we're also going to have this export line. Why is it there? Just part of the framework, just like we have with our batchable interfaces. We have to have an execute method. Here we have to export our class, and we have to extend the Lightning element that we imported from LWC. And just part of the standard Lightning Web Component framework. We have our import and our export. We can import more things, and we're going to see some examples of those in a little bit. The next thing we see here, though, that we also imported from LWC is this @track. And @track is something called a decorator. A decorator essentially means it's something we can add to our variables that give it some extra properties. So in the case of @track, by putting it on our greeting variable, we're going to do two things. Number one, we're going to indicate that it's a private variable. And number two, we're going to make it reactive, which means it's going to automatically re-render whenever it changes. So if you remember in Visualforce, we tell our output text to re-render when we click the button. Here @track is doing it for us. So anytime the greeting variable changes, our HTML UI is automatically going to re-render it. So that output is going to be automatically re-rendered. And we see we have a default value of world. We're also going to see our method here. Remember, we had onChange firing our handle change method. And handle change is going to take in the event, so the change event that called the method in the first place. And then we're going to see that our greeting is going to be reset to whatever the value is in the thing that fired the event. So basically, that just means whatever you typed in, we're going to get that value, and we're going to assign it to greeting, because greeting changed, because greeting is being tracked, it's automatically re-rendered, which is why as I'm typing in that input, the output is automatically updating. And that's the whole Lightning Web Component. One thing to note about @track, I think with the summer release, Salesforce makes almost all variables @tracked by default. So you may not see this explicitly as much anymore. But if you do see it, that's what @track is doing. And we're going to talk about some more decorators and some other demos as well. All right, so what did we see with this comparison here? We saw component markup like we're used to, right? The Lightning input tag, the paragraph tag. We saw code running based on events, right? Again, we're used to that with triggers. We saw our onChange event firing off the method. We saw variable and method bindings. We referenced the greeting variable and the handle change method in our UI. In our Lightning Web Component, because the files know about each other in the same bundle, we didn't have to tell our HTML UI what controller to use. It automatically knows because they're part of the same package. And we also saw we didn't have to wait for any button click to call Salesforce and return a response back. Everything happened in the browser. There was no Apex involved in that Lightning Web Component. And that's why it rendered a lot faster than our Visualforce did. All right, so that's great. We talked about what's old with components. Let's talk about what's new with Lightning Web Components, right? And the first thing we want to do is kind of why did Salesforce go down this path of Lightning Web Components? The biggest thing is that the standards kind of changed. So don't worry too much about every line in here, but focus more on kind of the ratio of green to orange. And back in 2014, the green here is the larger part of this, and this represents what JavaScript frameworks were doing. They were doing a lot of stuff, right? A lot of these frameworks you may be familiar with, React, Angular, they're pretty heavy frameworks, and they're doing a lot of stuff with them. The orange represents what the browsers are doing. And the browser's purpose back in 2014 was just kind of host everything. But if you fast forward to 2019, that ratio has shifted significantly. And the browsers actually can handle a lot of the heavy lifting. The frameworks don't have to do as much anymore. They have their specialized UI and have some other specialized stuff in them. But a lot of the web standards are standard for all the frameworks. So the frameworks can be a lot more lightweight. And so back in 2014, when Salesforce started working with Aura, the Aura framework was also pretty heavy and having to do a lot of stuff. But Salesforce responded to this kind of shift to the web standards by embracing them. And we see on the right side here, the web standards are actually handling a lot of the heavy lifting for us. So on the left side, the blue is everything the Aura framework had to handle. On the right side, we see a lot of that stuff has moved to standard, to web standards that are, as we saw from the beginning of this presentation, pretty common across the software industry. Now, the Lightning Web Component Framework still has things like built-in Salesforce security, the Lightning Data Service, some base components like the Lightning Input component we saw. But a lot of the stuff is just web standardization that any web developer can step in and start using and probably have some familiarity with. All right, so with that kind of embracing standards, that means there's more to learn with Lightning Web Components. So as I mentioned, these industry standards do a couple things. Number one, Salesforce joined a lot of industry standard boards, and they're actually going to have a hand in how these standards of the web develop now moving forward, which is great both for a Salesforce development perspective, but a development perspective at large. So now if you're looking to broaden your career, you're going to be learning skills by doing Salesforce development. They won't just help you with Salesforce, but they'll help you with any web development you want to do anywhere with any technology. In addition to that, if you have a buddy who's a web developer who's not necessarily used to Salesforce, you can let them know that, hey, it's cool to come over to Salesforce. A lot of the knowledge you already know from the web is directly applicable here. So it's going to vastly expand the developer ecosystem and also make Salesforce developer skills a lot more standardized and allow them to increase their worth in the kind of software ecosystem as well. So another thing we're going to see with Lightning Web Components is all of our logic is being moved to the controller. If you're familiar with Visualforce, you might be used to these complicated kind of bind values, if you will. We could kind of throw anything into the curly bracket bang, and Visualforce would evaluate it. Right? A variable plus some text plus another variable, Visualforce evaluates everything. We're not doing that anymore. Now all of the logic is going to be moved to the controller where it belongs, and the UI is just going to be rendering the result of that logic. So we're not going to see any complicated bind syntax in our UIs anymore. Another thing we're going to see with web components is the idea that we can use multiple Apex controllers. So we kind of had this in Visualforce with extensions, but we're going to be able to see, we're going to be able to take advantage of different controllers and specific methods across various Apex controllers as well in Lightning Web Components. Decorators, I mentioned we saw at track already. We're going to see 2 more, but these are properties that come with Lightning Web Components that allow us to give variables some additional properties. All right, so we're going to go through a couple more demos here, specifically focusing on what's new in Lightning Web Components. And I'm going to make all the code available to you afterwards, so don't worry about every single line of code and every little bit of syntax. But I want you to focus on the concepts and really what the code is doing kind of at a higher level. All right, so let's go take a look at some of these components here. So the first one's going to be this create accounts component called LDS create record. So I'm going to, I have two things here. I have this ID box, which looks to be disabled. And I have a name field I can type in, and then I have a button. And then I have a little message down here saying I can create a record without writing server-side code. And we should consider using some standard Salesforce components to do that. And there's also a link. I can view the source for this code. And that link is going to take me to a GitHub site that has this code specifically for LDS create record. All right, let's see what this component is actually doing. So here, I'm going to create a record. I'm going to call it Egypt. I'm going to create an account. And I see a message that the account was created. I see an account ID. And if I go over to my accounts, refresh this, I'm going to, in fact, see Egypt, probably with the same ID here, ending in HKHAAF, HKHAAF. So we see that the account was created. No Apex involved in this at all, by the way. So I created a record just from clicking a button and typing in a name. Now, if I want to change this, let's say I want to rename it Cairo. As soon as I change the value in here, that ID goes away. And now it assumes I'm talking about a new account. So I'm going to rename this, or create a new account rather, Cairo. And if I go back to my accounts, I'm going to, sure enough, see I have my Egypt account, and now I have my new Cairo Egypt account. All right, so let's go look at how we did all that. This is our entire UI for that web component there. One thing we see to begin is our template tag. Our template tag is kind of like our Apex page tag in Visualforce. It's just part of the framework. It's going to be there in all of our components. It's a standard HTML tag. That's just kind of how we start our components off with the template tag. The next thing we see are some base components that are also part of the framework, similar to how you have your components in Visualforce, right? You have your Apex page. Here we have our lightning card, just a section on a page, essentially. Maybe more similar to a page block. We have a lightning card, and the lightning card has a couple things on it. It has a couple lightning inputs. The ID, as we saw, is disabled. And we have another one called the name. And then we have a lightning button, right? So a couple components on the top of our page here. And again, we see some browser events that are going to be firing off methods. So the same onChange event we saw in our Visualforce comparison, right? When the value in the account name changes, we want to fire the handle name change event. And now I have my button. And when I click my button, I want to fire off an onClick event. So my onClick event is going to be called create account, which, as you imagine, is going to actually create the account, again, without any Apex. The other thing I see here is using that C tag I mentioned before. We see a tag called C view source. And we're using the default namespace. This actually references a component called view source. And we see that just like we can pass in parameters to methods in Apex, we can pass parameters into components in the Lightning Web Component framework. Here we're passing in a value to a variable called source. And we're passing in the value LWC/LDS create record. And then we see some text along with that. Let's go take a look at this view source component real quick. And remember, we're passing in a value to the source variable. All right, so view source is pretty small. Again, we have our template tag. Again, we have some standard HTML tags, div, p, and a being a URL tag. And our a tag has a property called href. Href is the actual link that it'll link to. So if you saw when I clicked on view source, like we see in line 5, it went to this source URL, which is a variable in our component here. And it took me to that GitHub website. So if I go take a look at the controller that's part of this view source bundle, viewsource.js, again, we see our import and our export statements. We have a base URL variable going to this GitHub base site. And we see our second decorator here, @API. So you remember in our component here, we have a source URL variable. And we know from our LDS create record component, there's also a source variable. So we see the base URL variable that we're not referencing anywhere else. we're seeing the source variable that we passed a value into, and we were able to pass a value into it because of this @API decorator. So @API works very similar to @track. The only difference is it makes it a public variable, so we can pass values into it from other components. So it makes it public and makes it automatically re-render if it changes. So we see base URL, we see source, and then that source URL variable we referenced in the component. We have our getter forward here, just like we have a getter in our Apex controller. And source URL is going to be equal to the base URL plus the source. So we can essentially put this view source component in any component. And it's always going to link to our GitHub base URL plus whatever suffix we pass in. So for this one, we passed in our LDS create record. So it took us to our GitHub site referencing the LDS create record component. And again, we see that calculation being done in the controller. And all we have to do in the UI is reference the variable. All right, so let's go back to our LDS create record component, though. We talked about view source. And we also remember we have these two events happening in our LDS create record. We have our onChange and we have our onClick. So when the name changes, we want to handle name change. And when the button is clicked, we want to create an account. So if we take a look at the controller for this now, we see actually a lot of import statements here. Again, we see we're importing Lightning element from LWC. And we also see we're going to import from some other Lightning libraries. We're going to import that toast component you saw when it said success account created. That's a toast coming from this other Salesforce library. And we're also importing something called create record from the UI record API. And that's going to be kind of the secret sauce that lets us create our account without using Apex. So we can import from LWC, we can import from Salesforce Lightning libraries, we can import custom components, right? Just like we saw C view source in our UI, we see C/LDS utils in our controller, and we're importing a method from our LDS utils component. So we can import from custom components. And then we can also import from our Salesforce model. We can import objects and we can import fields. And so here we see we're importing the account object, and we're importing the account.name field. And why it's important to do that is because you may have noticed whenever you try to reference an Apex, or sorry, a field in an Apex class, and you need to change the name of the field. It tells you, sorry, the field name can't be changed. It's referenced in all of these Apex classes. And if you really want to change it, you have to go comment it out everywhere, change it, and then uncomment it out everywhere. And it's a real pain. We don't have to do that anymore with Lightning Web Components, right? Lightning Web Components are metadata aware. And by importing them in, this account object and this account.name can be named anything they want. We don't care. We're going to reference them as account object and name field. So anywhere in our code, we're going to see account underscore object and name underscore field. So if those values change, we want to change the name, we want to change the object name, field name. Our import statements can automatically update themselves, but we don't have to change anything in the code because we've already imported them and assigned them a specific name, account object and name field in this case. So we can import a bunch of stuff here. We see we're tracking the account ID. So when the account ID changes, it's going to update. That's why you saw it appeared after we clicked the button. But here we have our handle name change event. And whenever the name changes, we're going to do two things. Again, we're capturing that event that caused the name change to fire. And we're going to reset the account ID. So again, whenever, as soon as I deleted a letter in that account name, the ID went away. It was a reset. And then our name variable here is going to be set to whatever was in that text box. So as I was changing, just like we saw in our Hello World, whatever's in the text box is going to be assigned to this name field. If I look lower down in the component, right, that was handle name change. When we click the button, we call the create account method. And create account is going to do a couple things. Again, remember those import statements from up above. We're going to basically construct some object here called fields. We're going to go get whatever the API name is of our name field. Maybe it changed. We don't know. We don't care because we're going to pull it in every time in line 19. We're going to set the name field equal to the name variable that we populated in our text box. And then line 20, we're going to create another structure of type account object. Again, it doesn't really matter what the object's API name is right now. We're going to recalculate it every time here in line 20. So if the account object got a new API name, great. We're going to get it in line 20 regardless of what it is. And so we're going to save our account. We have our fields that we calculated in line 19. And then if you remember, we imported create record from the record API. We're going to call that method, and that's what's going to create our account without any apex. And we see here it's setting the account ID variable, so that can automatically re-render because it's being tracked. It's going to show the toast and do some other stuff as well. That's essentially our entire create record component. All right, let's go take a look at one more component here. This is going to be our wire to Apex component. So now we're actually going to start working with Apex a little bit. So we saw a couple components that were all happening in the browser, no Apex needed. What if we want to use some Apex though? And so we have a method called Apex wire method to property. Again, we see this view source here. And if I open this in a new tab, again, we're going to go to our GitHub base URL, and we're going to pass in a new value, Apex wire method to property, and it's going to take us to this component. So view source, we know how that's working. What's happening in the rest of this here? We have some contacts listed, and we have some opportunities and their amounts listed. And so if I go look at my contacts, I can see all of those contacts here. So basically, I'm just pulling all the contacts from my org, and I'm pulling all the opportunities from my org and displaying the amounts alongside them. Right, so the component is pretty simple, but what is the code actually doing here? Right, so this is the first part of our UI here. Again, we see our template tag. Again, we see a lightning card tag. We see a header field that says contacts in line 4. Let's jump down to line 6 now. We have an if statement. So we're familiar with if statements from Apex, right? If something is true, do something. Works the same way in the UI. If something is true, display something. I think we have some if syntax we can use in Visualforce as well. So if context.data is true. So based on this syntax for context.data, we see we're referencing some variable, right? A variable called contacts with a property called data. And if true just means if there's something there, if it's not null. So if there's some value in context.data, then we're going to go into line 7, and we have a for loop in our UI. For each value in context.data, right, it's very similar to an Apex repeat, where we're just going to say for each value, we're going to call it contact, just like we have, for each I in an Apex for loop. For each contact in context.data, display the contact name, and we're going to give it a key of contact.id. So that was for context.data. Line 11 says if there's a value in context.error. Now we're going to run a reference this custom error panel component. So again, we're using that C namespace. And our error panel component is going to have an @API property called errors. And we're going to pass in context.error, and we're going to display some error there based on that component. And then we do the same thing for opportunities, right? We check if opportunities.data has a value. For each op in opportunities.data, display the op name followed by the op amount. Right, so just like we did with contacts, we're displaying some fields from the opportunity. And then again, we see if there's a value in opportunities.error, we're going to display our error panel again. All right, so the UI is a little bit more complex. Let's look at our controller for this now. This is our entire controller for that component. And let's walk through this here. Again, we see we're importing from LWC. And we see another place we can import from. Now we're importing from Apex. We're importing from an Apex controller called contact controller. And we're bringing in a method called getContactList. And then we're going to give it a value called getContactList. We can call it whatever we want. We also see we're going to be calling a second controller, opportunity controller, a method called getOpList. And again, we're calling it getOpList, but that name on the left side can be whatever we want. So we bring in these two methods from these two different controllers. Again, we see we're exporting. And now we see our third decorator. So we talked about @track, make it private, make it reactive. We talked about @API, make it public, make it reactive. And now we're talking about @wire. So at wire is going to wire some variable to some other library, class, property, something. In this case, we're wiring our variables to our Apex methods. So we're wiring our variable called contacts to our getContactList method, and we're wiring our variable called opportunities to our getOpList method. And so @wire is going to do a couple of things. Number one, it allows us to connect a variable to something else, such as an Apex class, or an Apex method, rather. And it's going to give that variable two properties, .data and .error. So .data is going to be whatever is returned from the thing we wired it to. So in that case, whatever is returned from the Apex method goes into the .data property. If there's any error that happens as the result of our method, that's going into the .error property. So in a UI, we reference context.data, context.error. Those properties exist because we use the @wire decorator. So if I take a look at getContactList, getOpList, not doing anything too crazy there. We're just selecting some fields from contact. We're selecting some fields from opportunity. We're used to annotating our methods with @future already. For methods we reference from Lightning Web Components, we have to use the @aura enabled annotation. But otherwise, we're just making Stockwell calls here. So we're getting our list of contacts. If there's no issue, we're going to assign it to context.data, and then we're getting a list of opportunities. If there's no issue, we're going to assign it to opportunities.data. And then if we go back to our UI, right, remember, ran a Stockwell query, we got context.data. For each contact in context.data, display the contact name. If there's an issue, send it to our error component. And then the same thing for opportunities. For each opportunity in opportunities.data, display the name followed by the amount. All right, so what did we see in these components here? Again, we saw more component markup, right? We saw some template tags, we saw some lightning input. We saw some paragraph tags for our output and standard HTML. We saw some variable and method bindings on change, on click, and then our contacts, opportunities variables. We talked about 3 different decorators, @track, @API, and @wire. And then we also saw we can import from pretty much anywhere. We can import from LWC, we can import from Salesforce libraries, we can import from custom components, we can import from Apex controllers, we can import our Apex objects and fields. Pretty much anywhere we want to take something from, we can bring it in to a Lightning Web component. I think that's pretty cool. All right, so that was all step 1. How do we go about taking step 2? Right? We know web development's already popular. We've seen JavaScript's been king since 2013. And we've also seen that Salesforce has been evolving to meet demands. It started out with Aura, and now it's on the Lightning Web Component framework, trying to standardize across the web. We talked about some similarities between the front end and the back end in Salesforce, and we also saw some new stuff as well. And ultimately, it's my strong belief that LWC Lightning Web Components are both the present and the future of Salesforce development. Web development is extremely strong, and by standardizing, Salesforce is going to basically be incentivized to not change, especially since they're the ones that are having a say in what those standards will be moving forward. And again, this is just step 1. So hopefully it makes a little bit more sense if you're used to the back-end Apex. In terms of next steps and resources, just like with any Visualforce tag, you can look up any base component tag in the component library. Salesforce has a sample gallery, which has pre-built Lightning Web Component apps. Essentially, you can go in and just take the code directly from there using the sample applications and sample components they've built. Salesforce has a whole site dedicated to Lightning Web Components, lwc.dev. They have a trail mix on Trailhead, sfdc.co/lwc. I think there's a new Lightning Web Components specialist super badge out now as well as a JavaScript developer, Salesforce certified JavaScript developer certification. And then the instructor that leads, if you are used to Aura components, the instructor that is teaching the Aura to LWC kind of transition class for Salesforce developed a doc as well, and you can find that at bit.ly/Aura to LWC. Right, so all the resources are great. Great step 2. If you're interested in going even further and customizing kind of the look and feel, I highly recommend checking out the Lightning Design System, lightningdesignsystem.com. Salesforce has a bunch of pre-built kind of icons, utilities, classes for adding pictures, changing how the CSS looks, adding margins, adding padding, adding bordering, accordions, without having to customize the CSS yourself. You can add some classes to your components, and the Lightning Design System is going to take care of the look and feel for you. All right, and so with that, again, thank you, Shukran. Thank you so much for having me today. My name is Adam Olshansky. Feel free to connect with me after. All of the code is available on GitHub, github.com/adam17amo/LWC101.
Thanks, Adam. This was a really amazing session. Okay, so we are open right now for questions. So if anyone has a question to ask Adam about the Lightning components, I myself have a question. I want to ask about the testing of the Lightning components. How would one go with that? Is there like a special feature for testing, or do we just test the Apex methods or classes?
Sure. So there is no requirement to test Lightning Web Components from the Salesforce side. There are, however, public kind of JavaScript testing frameworks such as Jest and Jasmine, I believe, that you can use to test your JavaScript. And I know Salesforce, I think with the summer release, added some commands to the CLI, kind of create some tests, kind of skeleton tests as well via SFDX.
Okay, so it's not required. You just have to cover the Apex class or method, and you're good to go. I think that's really amazing.
From a deployment perspective, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted also to ask another question. Is there some kind of feature in Aura components that is not in Lightning Web Components? I ask this because sometimes people prefer Aura, or sometimes they make the Aura interact with the Lightning. So I don't know why do they do that.
So for the first question, are the things in Aura that are not in LWC? I believe so, yes. The main one that comes to mind is you can dynamically create Aura components from a Visualforce page or from another Aura component, whereas you can't really dynamically create Lightning Web Components. You just kind of have to bring them in as they are. So like there's a create component method for Aura that doesn't exist for LWC. So there are some, I think, slight things like that that don't necessarily exist yet because LWC is relatively new. But that's kind of where all of Salesforce's development resources are focusing on. So I'd imagine we'd see, we won't really see too many additions to Aura, and kind of like with Lightning versus Classic, all of the new stuff is coming to LWC now. In terms of the second question was like, you were asking about how they interact or why someone would interact with one or the other.
Yes.
Yeah, I know the Salesforce is also working on something called the Lightning Message Service, I think, which is in beta right now, which is supposed to be kind of this top-level platform that lets your Visualforce talk to your Aura to talk to your LWC. But I think kind of depending on your requirements, there are some, I think like in, I want to say, I know we have a mobile community that's using Visualforce and Aura components right now, and LWC doesn't necessarily play nicely yet with some of that. So kind of depending on some of the restrictions, you might see one over the other. But there are also people who have been developing an Aura for a few years now and are more familiar with that. Or if you already have a bunch of stuff pre-built in Aura, there might be some things that make more sense to keep in Aura. But as I mentioned, the Lightning Web Components tend to be more performant because Aura is just packaged up LWC. So you're intentionally adding some performance hit to it by building it. So I would recommend all new development as much as you can focus on LWC.
Okay, we have a question in the chat. Someone's asking whether we could use Lightning Web Components in quick actions.
Lightning Web Components. So somebody said Lightning Web Components has to be wrapped in Aura for use in a quick action. That is possible. Let me see. I'd have to look that up. I don't know off the top of my head. Let me see if I can find anything on it real quick. Oops. Hang on 1 second. Okay. Okay. Actions. Okay, looks like you might have to wrap it up in an Aura component for now.
Okay, great. Okay, there's also another question. Can I deploy Lightning Web Component in production without an Apex class?
Yes. So as we saw with like the Hello World component or the Create Accounts component, there was no Apex in either of those components, so those can go to production without needing any tests. Although I would recommend testing it on your own before putting anything in production.
Okay.
One thing also to note, LWC, you cannot develop them directly in the dev console. So you need to either go through IDE like VS Code or IntelliJ, Illuminated Cloud. But Salesforce is working on, I think they announced it at Trailhead DX, the kind of new web-based Visual Studio editor. And that will allow you to develop in LWC.
Okay. So are there any more questions?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. So,
Okay.
so Adam, like you have shown one example in the beginning, right, for the comparison between Visualforce and the LWC. So there you are using a button to trigger the action, right? So in Apex input, there is no on-change event which we can directly use in Visualforce, and we can also incorporate those changes in the client side itself, right, within Apex page. If we do that, is it considered as a client side or that is still in the server?
So with Visualforce, there are some kind of action methods with Visualforce, like action puller and action function, I think, that happen using JavaScript. But since Visualforce is hosted on the server, I think by nature, to my understanding, it's all happening on the server. So there is still a kind of performance hit that you have to wait for the call and response from the browser.
Okay.
Because if you remember, Visualforce is all hosted on the server.
Server, right. So whatever we do, it is still going on the server only. I got it.
Yeah.
And the second question is, so this is just a general question, right? So even with a lot of enhancements and improvements in the Lightning, right, I still feel that Classic is still giving better performance in Lightning. So what's your thoughts about that? Did you also feel, or is that not true?
I think it depends on where you're looking. There are definitely some things in the Lightning experience that need to be improved. For example, the performance side and setup. I've noticed a lot of things are kind of iframed in, like when I'm creating a new field, it's kind of jarring because I see the classic UI in the Lightning space. I know when I'm dealing with managed packages and I try to update something, Lightning takes too long or doesn't work, so I just have to go into Classic and it's faster. So there still are some things that I do jump back to Classic for, but for the most part, all the new interesting stuff is coming into Lightning. So I would highly recommend moving to the Lightning experience because that's where all the new stuff is coming. But yeah, I do agree, and Salesforce is aware that there still are some improvements that need to be made, especially on the performance side of Lightning for sure. I think it's, in some places it is a little bit less performant, but I think the look and feel of Classic is kind of very 90s. So it is a little outdated. Yeah, I know if you look here, one of the things I remember they were telling me at Dreamforce, if I go pretty much to any page, and I refresh it, this header bar tends to render before, like this is taking a while now, but the header tends to render before everything else. And that's because the header is built in LWC and the rest of this is built, I guess this is LWC also. But on a lot of standard pages, this header is in LWC and the rest of the stuff is in Aura. So that's why you see this rendering a little bit faster. So hopefully as they start kind of rebuilding everything in LWC, Lightning will get a little bit faster as well.
Yep, thanks for the detailed explanation. One last question again. So we have the Lightning flow also as well, right? So whatever if there is a small requirement which has to be done in LWC and which can also be done in Lightning flow, which way I have to go? Is a Lightning component is better, or I can go for the Lightning flow?
I know there have been a ton of resources being invested in flow. For that, I think it'll really kind of depend on the requirement and maybe even who's building it. Like for me personally, I don't really know that much about flow, so I would probably opt for the component, but I know there are a lot more cases where it makes more sense to do things in flow, especially now they're building in kind of the, the trigger like before and after event logic in there as well. So it kind of depends on what the requirements are and maybe what the future requirements are. If it's, planning on, I guess it probably depends more than anything on how customized the UI needs to be. Because I think if you can build the UI with flow, then go for it. If the UI may be changing, maybe getting more complex later, then it make more sense to do it in LWC because you can customize that a little bit easier.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Are there any more questions for Adam here? Okay, so I think we have reached the end of this meeting. Thanks a lot, Adam. This was really insightful, and I think it simplified Lightning components for everyone here a little bit. I also want to thank Kishk for his session about custom metadata, custom settings, and custom permissions. It was really also informative and a lot of new information for today. So thank you both, and thanks for being very flexible with the timings, and I hope we'll meet again, inshallah. I just want to say something in Arabic for the Egyptian people here. إن شاء الله يا جماعة يكون في مسابقة ساعة 10:30 أسئلة كشك هيحطها على جروب الفيسبوك، واللي هيكسب إن شاء الله ياخد فري فاوتشر $200 فاوتشر يعني لامتحان سيلز فورس. فstay tuned يعني على الفيسبوك جروب. Thank you both.
Thanks, Farah.
Thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Adam. Bye.
Bye.